Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Shanti Shanti. Welcome back to today's discussion on cooperative communities. Master's vision, Paramhansa Yogananda's vision for the future. And today, this being the third class, I'd like to move on to the topic which I've titled, Why Do Communities Fail? And that's the title of one of the chapters in Swamiji's original book, Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why. And so I'm referring some of what he said in that book, but also adding a little bit of my own ideas on that. But before we begin that, though, I want to just very quickly, I hope quickly, go back to last week and just finish up a few loose ends and give a little bit of attention to a topic that I mentioned at that time, but I want to go a little bit more deeper. And last week I said that we live in an age which we're learning socially, as a society, we're learning to transcend self-interest and graduate into a higher understanding of enlightened self-interest. But as long as the age we're in right now, the evolutionary cycle we're in right now, where self-interest is the norm and the dominant, you might say, determinant of human behavior, self-interest, getting ahead. People interpret that, of course, I'm seeking happiness, but of course that happiness it's a good motivator. Of course, it's self-interested happiness and it's not expansive. As long as we're in that phase of human evolutionary consciousness, expanding consciousness, awakening consciousness, we can expect perhaps it would be wise, maybe the better way to say that, it would be wise for us to expect the potential for certain negative consequences. And this is of course, one of the reasons why cooperative communities, intentional communities can help that should these consequences come to fruition. And some of these are, the more we can expect that those with more power, more influence will dominate, and there will be people over those who have less power and less influence. And so you're going to get a natural social dichotomy, which is always the case. You're going to have a spectrum, but it's going to be the rich over the poor, you might say. There's a certain dominating factor, and the poor, of course, suffer the consequences. And we will continue, as long as that self-interest is motivating society, we'll continue to have a world made up of the haves and the have-nots. Now, again, there's always going to be some, but to the extremes that we're seeing, and it seems to be somewhat even accentuating, that trend is going to continue unless consciousness change, which unfortunately, it doesn't have to be this way, but it leads in a worldly sense that it leads to oppressors and oppressed. And that can't be sustained. Ultimately, there's a reaction against that, and that leads to trouble, of course. And it's basically a selfish self-interest can inevitably lead, unless it's modified or expanded into enlightened self-interest, a selfish distribution of wealth and resources, and also it's a selfish distribution of knowledge, and that being, of course, one of the resources. And of course, also the natural consequence is a certain amount of fear and mistrust of others' motives, and you're seeing that playing out in the world today. And the inevitable other consequences that I could go on with all that, if you get racial hatred, class division, religious prejudice, and all of these tensions that to some degree we're seeing in the world today. And are those going to be alleviated and moderated? In the long run, I suspect so. In the short run, who knows? And all of this is to say that we live in uncertain times, and you might even say we live in an unsafe age, age. And although it's true that society as a whole has made notable progress over the last few centuries. We got a long way to go, and I think a lot more needs to happen. And unless that consciousness change, there's a tendency, a likelihood of discord, social unrest. And so if we don't change voluntarily, change, you might say, becomes forced upon us. And this is what Yogananda said. Paramhansa Yogananda said that the underlying causes of warfare, such as World War II, are these underlying selfishness of too much self-interest or domination of one part of society on another part of society, and that leads to warfare, such as World War II, as he said in his lifetime. That was an underlying attitudinal social cause. Now, it manifests, of course, in all different ways, but these are unconscious thought levels that ultimately take expression outwardly. And so you might say there's a good reason for communities. You might say it is a hedge against the vicissitudes of changing societal conditions. And it's a little bit of a reactionary to that. And you might say, as many times, just as I mentioned last week, American pilgrims, they formed communities because they felt themselves to be under threat. Well, that's one motivation for communities. Find a safe place to protect oneself. And I suspect that, if you see society going a certain way, that can be a motivation as well. And so consequently, what Paramhansa Yogananda advised, start communities, not necessarily only for this reason, because of that, there's general reasons, but it's a hedge against these hard times. And start a community, buy a piece of land, grow your own food, be more self-sufficient, and being able to take care of yourself should social unrest come upon the earth. And if we look back historically, it's cycles. Things go in cycles. And so is this what I'm saying? Are these, and he did predict in the future there would be these times of social unrest. Are they inevitable? And he said, no, nothing in this world is inevitable because we have free will. And individually, of course, we have that. And you could say societally, we have that too. So nothing is inevitable. But if you see trends, one person making a change in consciousness may not change even a small group may not change the larger trend. And so you have these, you could say hard times can be avoided. Is it likely? Well, Yogananda warned us. And so you could say, as a world society, we need to take these things seriously and awaken to the dangers of selfish behavior and to where it inevitably leads. And that applies to us as individuals, and it does apply to society as a whole. So this too, and I wanted to clarify that and emphasize that this too is a good motivation. And should hard times come, is his communities being a hedge against that. But let's move on. Now, why do communities fail? And before I go into some of the reasons that Swami Kriyananda mentioned, and that we ourselves can come up with some ideas about that, what is failure really? Now, is it a failure if a community, like we look back in historical times and communities came up, they lasted for 100 years, and time passed and it wasn't no longer necessary, or for whatever reason, they stopped. Is that a failure? And I don't think that's the right word to use, because we have to remember, communities are there to serve the interests of the people who join them and create them. They're not in and of themselves a necessity to continue on just because if they're no longer a necessity. So you see this when communities sometimes form because of outward circumstances. It's a good way to respond to it. But the circumstances change, and whatever that brought that group of people together, they're not there, and so they move on. Everything in this world changes inevitability. And so consequently, this can be a danger to a community. So, oh my God, we started in this particular form and now something's changed. Oh, it's terrible. Well, if you're not able to change to meet circumstances, I think you become ossified. And then you find that time goes by and you're no longer appropriately answering the needs of the age in which you live. That's certainly not something to, embed within the consciousness of your community. You have to be, a community as a group of people need to be flexible to meet the needs of the people. And so consequently, there's evolution that takes place. And so the failure I'm speaking about is, you might say, the short term, because we don't know the long term. Everything is going to go sooner or later. Bodies come, bodies go, societies come, societies go. Rome lasted how many hundreds of years, centuries, and eventually went, and the societies come and go. We're speaking here about, you might say, the short-term things. And so those sorts of things to look to, and failure even then, maybe don't think that is the right word. Even if community comes, great inspiration, it lasts for 5 years, it served the needs of those people, and it was an ideal, and people change, and it moves on, and it dissolves. It inspired people for a short term. And those people, who knows what those individuals may take into the future, but even the existence of it in a short time, it had a good effect on other people. And the idea itself continues to inspire the next crop of people. And it's an answer to needs of the community, the needs of the individual who are serving there. And so let's keep that in mind, and not the community is built to serve mankind, or the individuals, not the other way around. And so consequently, I think, but if of course, they don't have to. It's not necessarily they dissolve, but sometimes they dissolve unnecessarily. And especially if they dissolve and there's any negativity, residual negativity, that's something we want to avoid. And you could say one of the, I think, primary reasons, or let's say this would be listed as being listed first, is they fail because they lack a clear sense of purpose. And this is something, when in starting a community, we have to ask, why is this community starting? What's the goal? What's the purpose of this community? What's the binding factors that are bringing us together and holding us, and are going to be able to hold us together? What's the reason for this community? And sometimes you find that people have come together, and the reason for coming together was just a very temporary reason. A group of friends, they came together, and at a certain point, let's say college friends went together, and all of a sudden they want to get together. They form this little community. And, your purposes of when you're 20 years old or 25 years old may be very different than when you're 35 years old. And the community no longer serves that purpose. Well, in a sense, it was a good thing while it lasted, but it naturally evolved into something else. Other times, it's perhaps an intentional community, and it comes together, and you find that the purposes are ephemeral. They come and they go. And if you want a community to have a little bit more lasting purpose, a lasting existence, then you have to go back to the ideals of why that community was formed in the first place. And perhaps those goals need to be modified. They need to be flexible on other, or perhaps there's no central coherent goal that is transcendent over time. And I think this is, and you don't want to be stuck in the past and the outward expression of that. So you have to have both, you might say, something that's lasting and also something that's flexible, an expression of those ideals that is flexible with time. I know in the United States there's a religious community that somewhat rejects technology. And so consequently, they don't drive cars. They horse and buggies, still in certain parts of America. There's communities of those. It's a religious-based community. They started back before technology, and they have horse and buggies. But that's technology too. But they've held on to the past in that form. So you can find that does that community have the ability to succeed in the future? Well, so far they're still going, but you can see they have a certain isolation to them that separates them from the larger community outside. And you wonder, generation after generation, young folks, do they want? Is that what they want? Well, time will tell. But I think an ideal has to be a living ideal, something that's, I think, larger and more transcendent. And that, of course, is the founding principles. And you have to stick to that. I mean, that is what helps people stick together. And I think it's no accident that successful communities over the long haul have been ventures that have been successful are basically religious based because they're transcendent. They go beyond individuals, and they're eternal truths, Sanatana Dharma, that apply in all circumstances. And then we, as we pass through, time passes, we have to then apply that in deeper and deeper ways, and new ways as outward circumstances change. But the inward Sanatana Dharma, the basic principles that we're based on, they remain, more constant. For example, cooperation. We're talking here about cooperation. That's you might say an eternal principle, and so consequently we hold to that. God is the doer in life. The willingness to sacrifice for that, the willingness to be expansive, enjoy. All of these are basically religious spiritual principles. That's why communities based on those tend to be more successful in the long term. Whereas if you don't, they tend to dissolve if you don't have things that are lasting. Now, a second, you might say, reason that is somewhat related to that is, and why you might say spiritual communities, religious communities tend to have a success rate. You have to have an ideal that you're willing to sacrifice for. You see, now this, of course, goes to the heart of this question of self-interest. You have to be willing to sacrifice your self-interest for something higher. And in a religious community, of course, in a spiritual community, yes, I'm willing to sacrifice my likes and dislikes for a larger principle of cooperation, transcendence, transcending ego likes and dislikes. And that is a daily task, to be, when you take it on a spiritual level, to transcend the ego and its manifestations of immediate self-interest, or me and mine, or my family and as opposed to your family. That's a constant. And if you don't have an ideal that's transcendent, are you going to sacrifice for it? And as time goes by, you find that people, and you could watch to see if a community is being successful. To what degree are members, willing to sacrifice for their ideals? And this world is always kind of calling us, it's easier to go this way, because it's a little bit hard to sacrifice, my likes, as opposed to cooperating. There's the good of the whole versus my personal good. That's something that is always going to be there. And if you find in time people are not able to make that sacrifice for the benefit of the larger principle, the cooperative, the community, whatever those ideals were, then it becomes more difficult. So that's the second point. And another one is, you could say, sometimes, as I mentioned, forces bring people together for a certain reason. We're going to start this because there's certain outer forces that are inspiring us. And you could take hard times, for example, as one. That was a force. But what that brought us together to buy land together, and work together. Now, let's say those forces disappear. Are you still going to be together or not? Have you found something positive within to take the place of whatever were those forces outside? And I mentioned last week how the early pilgrims to America, they came together, and there were certain forces that were forcing them for self-protection and survival. In time, those passed, and of course, the idea of having to cooperate and work together in a very immediate practical sense, not needed anymore. And so they went off in other directions. So again, they don't, if you're creating it in response to outward forces, sometimes that's one reason. The force is no longer there. You don't have something more transcendent than that to keep together. And that reason, you might say, for why communities don't last. And this one was, Swami would mention this one. He would say, his words were, the unsuccessful experiments were founded on too idealistic a view of human nature. And that's true. It's true. Sometimes, because you're at a certain point in your life where you're very idealistic and you want to live up to those ideals, and it's going to give all my efforts to this, and people begin to fall short, and because I can't live up to that high ideal. And I know when I was young, I was extremely idealistic in that way, and I have to admit, I had some disdain for people who didn't, or to the world at large, and that's a certain amount of spiritual pride, that goes with that. But when you're in your 20s, it tends to be that way. But you could see this in a social movement. And then I mentioned last week, communism, for example, it sounds really noble. It's great, that, we're going to, to all from each according to their ability, to all according to their needs, and we're going to give everything to the common pool, and that which we need will gain from it. Now, that's my mind kind of worked like that. But it's pretty idealistic, and it's very idealistic. And you see, when that has been played out in a number of different scenarios, even the kibbutzim, to some degree, they lasted for a while. And, and that idealism probably even in communist societies lasted for a while. And there were certain people that were motivated. And it's highly motivating because it's a high ideal if lived compassionately. Early Christians, after the time of Christ, they came together in societies like that, and they were motivated. So it's a beautiful ideal, but it's very, very idealistic. And in the modern world, you find that the larger principle here, Swami, is if the ideals are beyond the ability of individuals to really fully embrace them for a sustained period of time, you need to watch out for that. And what you find also is maybe the founding members hold to that, but the founding members get old, and can they hold it through a lifetime? Can they pass it on to a new generation? So you have to, as Paramhansa Yogananda used to say, it's wonderful to have ideals. Wonderful. We need them. We have to have ideals to be motivated. But then he said, be practical in your ideals. In other words, how do you express those ideals? Need to be held in balance with practicality. Practicality in terms of where human nature is right now. We haven't reached societally where we're all saints. And so we have to be able to put something into place and work together that accommodate the consciousness of which we live in right now. So we want to be practical and we want to be noble. But then what works and what doesn't? And I think this was one of Swami's Kriyananda's gifts. He was practical and he was idealistic. And he used to say this. He said, when you're not sure, ask this question: what works? You see, because it can sound great in theory, but does it work? And so we have to find, now you can't put in, we have to find some way to translate that. Now, of course, people then, when they take a step down, okay, we need to have a system. If we can just devise a system to take care of all of these minor details of living together, that'll solve it. And yes, you do have to have a system. There has to be some sort of system, but you can't rely upon a system to take the place of human goodwill, of human spirit. You have to have spirit in there, because any system is only going to be, if a human system is not also inspirationally motivated and has you're not going to be able to define everything. And so the spirit is more important than the rules. So Yogananda said in his advice, he says, don't make too many rules. Keep the spirit alive, but yet you have to have practical applications. And balancing those two is not a science, it's an art. And I think people of good intentions can manage an art. But if you just rely on systems, you find it in the long run very difficult to keep the spirit alive. And so you always have to balance. Those two have to be balanced. And so, if it's just rules, pretty soon you have to have too many committees, and you have oversight and organizational priorities, and all of the things come in, and you forget the individual. And so this is the art of living and building a community, this balance between having some practical applications that work, and but also making exceptions. In a compassionate, human way. Encourage people. You have to encourage people, and you have to be willing to sacrifice. Those who have the spirit have to have the spirit to go to give some slack to those that are slackers, you might say, because everybody, and you realize in a community, change is always going on, and individuals who may be not living up to the ideal right now long as their intentions is in the right direction, well, you encourage each other. And so you bring really this is the Christian spirit of the early Christians when they came together after Christ, living up to that Christ ideal. And if some people don't, you don't condemn them and throw them out, and you have compassion, you love. And so if you have that ideal to bringing people together under an umbrella of brotherly love, then you're going to find that you're more likely to be successful. But too many rules kill the spirit. And I think one thing to watch out for in any community are people volunteering. Are people volunteering their time and their energy to whatever the community is, because it shows a spirit. If everything's measured on the clock and it's just a system-based, and that has a certain lack of heart in a way. If everything becomes monetary or mandatory, there's less giving, less personal initiative. And now, I wish I could make a series of rules for all that, but of course that goes directly against what I'm trying to say. But these sorts of things, to keep it in mind. Another issue here is, and this is something that I've seen in my own personal experience, is that the belief that a return to nature will automatically produce good people. And this is sort of this romantic idealism of nature is perfectly beautiful, and if we just return to nature, everything would be wonderful, or to our natural spirit. And it just doesn't work that way. Because you found communities that sometimes the tendency is to reject modernism of the world, rejecting technology. I mentioned that in terms of, the Shaker communities, or those that have horse and buggy, that maintaining that. Not to say that they serve their purpose. I mean, that's great as long as it lasts. But I remember when we were first starting Ananda community, there was a good measure of people who wanted. It was a back to nature ideal, grow our own food, build our own houses, I embraced that. That was my ideal. But you can go so far with it that pretty soon it becomes impractical. And I remember there was one fellow that he wanted to build a little outbuilding And, it was in the early days of getting started, where we needed all hands on deck to get the place together, get things organized. And he insisted on not using any nails, putting this building together. It all had to be done without nails. Now, maybe without hammers too. I don't, because that was too modern. So he was all, things were fit. All the wood went together, which is kind of a nice ideal, and you can do that. It's kind of a nice craft job. Well, he was not a craftsman, but he tried to, and he spent months building this simple little building. And of course, people would say, look, we don't have time for that. No. And his whole life was, you might say, an extension of that sort of an attitude. And it was so impractical. And obviously, he got it done, and it was all rickety, and it didn't hold up, and it was gone by the end of that first winter. It fell apart. Practical idealism, that was not. So, but it kind of gives but the more of what, when Swami Kriyananda mentioned this particular thing, he was talking about this 19th century Rousseau, the French idealist, with the noble savage. And I think anybody who has that idea, and Swami was quite dismissive of it. He says they don't have their eyes open to see that is a very naive approach. That, yes, unfortunately, people are just being simple does not make one noble, and so consequently you end up becoming simple-minded rather than simply practical. But anyway, it was something. But the larger ideal is to have ideals that are beyond the capacity of human nature in our situation in which we find ourselves today. And another aspect of this is one of what Swami said, is somewhat of an extension that is everybody's perfect, and they're good at heart, and they're all loving. If we can just bring that loving nature out of people, everything's going to work out. Well, in principle, that may be true, but in practicality, it doesn't always work that way. And so Swami, and not only him, but all of us living in Ananda, especially in the early days, realized that we have to screen our applicants who want to join this community. Just because there was a joke we used to have from the Jyotish Novak, our Dharmacharya here, in the early days said, yes, in the early days, if somebody came to the gate and they said Om 3 times, we welcome him in. And he says, unfortunately, that's not enough, because sometimes you have people who are not able to live up to the ideals that you have put into place. And people may aspire to those ideals, and that's obviously a requirement. You need to, in other words, what are you saying? You need to have some requirements and some way to screen applicants who come in that meet some standard, and otherwise you're going to find, as time goes by, people may say the right thing, and they may have aspirations, but human nature being what it is, they'll perhaps fall down to their natural density and can be problems. And so consequently, too many rules kill the spirit, but no rules will also destroy it. It'll destroy it as well. So you have to have something. And so where is that happy medium? Now, I think it's up for each community, of course, has to come to that. At Ananda Village, we ran into this. The first year, 1969, was a bit chaotic. That's an understatement. But it was a bit chaotic, but it was fun, too. When a lot was learned. It was very joyful, very energetic. But we realized that wasn't going to work. And so that winter, most people left because there was no housing, no facilities really to be able to survive the winter at that time. So people left. And Swami Kriyananda had advised people, go back to the cities, make some money, and come back and be able, so we have some funds to start things and resources and, think ahead. And so some people did go back to the city. And then one, to gather resources. I know Jyotish Novak himself, he perceived that the community had no economic base. And so he went back to San Francisco, where he was from, had been living before, and he spent the winter learning how to make incense. And he thought, I'll come back and we'll start a factory, a little home craft factory of making incense. And now that may not sound practical today, 60 years later, but at that time, it was, because it was a good product and it was becoming fashionable. And he did this, and he came back. Through his efforts and people helping, were able to create that. And it was an employee. It employed people for many years. So that, eventually it outlived itself, but it lasted for at least 10, 15 years. Other people went and learned other skills. There was 2 or 3 other businesses that came out of that winter. And when people did start to trickle back in the spring, it was when we realized that we had to start a new footing. We had to be a little bit more organized. Now we had a little bit of experience under our belt. And so and I still remember, in the springtime came, people were coming back. Swami Kriyananda had continued to pay the financial obligations from his own efforts of teaching that winter. But he said, I can't continue to do this. I mean, we all have to participate. And we had a community meeting, and Swami wasn't there at that meeting, but just all together we came. The few of us, it was a small group at that time because not many had come back, but there were a couple dozen people, and we realized we needed to have financial stability, practical. We were going to have to find a way to generate income. And so we made a rule, if you will, or a protocol that everybody had to be financially responsible. And we taxed ourselves a fee. Every month, everybody had to pay a certain amount, whether you could afford it or not afford it. If you could not afford it, go to the city, make some money. Go to the neighboring town, make some money. Do something else. But to stay here, you had to be able to monthly make a payment. And it was modest, very modest. But it set the tone. And it was from that moment, I think, when the community people came together and self-taxed themselves a fee that was required. I have always felt that was a moment when the community really began on a practical level, because there was taking responsibility at that point. And it was that modest sum. We used it to pay the mortgage, and a monthly mortgage, which was required to pay for the land. And extra on top of that, we would expend for maintenance and the necessities of group living. And at the same time, we instituted the protocol that each person was responsible for paying that fee, and each person was responsible for their daily necessities. And we had a group kitchen up to that time. Sometimes people contributed. Often they did not. And same thing with the vehicles, taking, but there was no expectations it was a one-way street. And it was all voluntary, coming in terms of who would pay what and who would. And we instituted certain things. No, this can't be free because we just cannot afford to do this. Everybody has to take responsibility. And so we instituted that. And that is, I felt, when the community began. And we had a few other codes, you might say. That were quite famous in those days. We used to say we only had 3 rules: no drugs, no alcohol, no dogs. The dog came a couple of years later after we had bad experiences. But even that we have from time to time made some exceptions. But you see, the idea here is you have to have a few things that are practical that meet the needs of the community. And so consequently, I mentioned just these few things in Ananda's example. There were also expectations, but the requirements, we tried to keep them short. And of course, there are many things that were unspoken. Obviously, abusive behavior was not tolerated. You couldn't, that was, and general human codes of conduct. You had to follow the laws and you had to do things such as that, but we didn't feel there was any need. Those were expectations of of course, you would do those sorts of things. And each community, if you're going to start, you have to ask yourself, what do you feel is a necessity? And so consequently, rather than just leaving it, you might say, up to natural evolution, you might say, what comes. Because if you don't, eventually something may force you, to do something. So if you can anticipate, then you're going to save yourself trouble in the future. And another point that this is one that Swami Kriyananda makes, and I think it's very interesting because it's very application. It comes into application. And it applies. And he says, I'm going to quote here, Swamiji says, perhaps one of the greatest mistakes that community planners made in communities that didn't succeed was attempt to do too much with their plans. He goes on to say, no system can create virtue. The most it can do is facilitate the development of virtue. For virtue is a development that must always spring from the goodwill of the individual member. And so the thought that we can create virtue through the right system, don't count on it. Don't count on it. We have to have, you could say a community, if it becomes too rigid and system bound, it's not going to be flexible enough to accommodate human nature. And one thing I've noticed in being involved in Ananda for decades and decades is a community has to allow, and members, and this comes down to the individual members, has to allow and accommodate change. Change in people, and change for people to make mistakes even, because people do. People change. They start out with one great ambition and it turns out they get straitjacketed into that, and as individual souls, they're not growing, and they need to change. And so you have to be accommodating to individuals, allowing them to change, allowing them to become different people, better people, you hope, and you allowing the same thing. The community itself has to be able to change to accommodate that. And this can be challenging if a community is founded on rigid systems. There needs to be built in some way to be able to change those systems. Now, some people think, well, we can write a code, a constitution, and have means by which to do that. I guess you could, but my reaction to that was politics. I don't want to live in a community that's, like that. And again, it comes back to the spirit, trying to keep it simple. And a community is there to meet the needs of the individuals. A community will change. People will change. And so allow for that. Another point. Again, I'll read what Swami says here. A common failing of new communities has been the tendency to demand too radical a change in their members. Evolution never moves by sudden leaps. Leniency must be granted people, within reason, to grow at their own rate of speed. And again, people don't, and if a community is set up with ideals that are too far above where people are right now in their understanding, it's going to cause problems. So you have to realize people are coming because they aspire. Now, in a spiritual community, they aspire to be saints. That doesn't mean they are saints. And so consequently, you have to be flexible to allow for that and not have those sorts of unwarranted expectations. And I look back on my own self when I was in the 20s. I had that tendency to, I remember, well, I won't go into it. It's too personal. But I remember that tendency is to just relax, Jaya. You could just let it be. And I was much happier. Everybody else was, I'm sure, was much happier too. So again, and then Swami just goes on, another defect in certain communal experiments has been a tendency to isolationism. Again, people come together because there's a certain amount of rejection of society. And oftentimes you see this, we're going off to the jungle to create a new community and get away from all of that evil influence. And yeah, I can understand that. But isolationism is perhaps not a good way to go because we cut ourselves off from the challenges, perhaps. And the fact is, some people go out there, but is it going to sustain? You go out to the jungle. It's not so nice in the jungle, always. And you find it's not probably going to translate to the next generation. Those individual founders maybe found that satisfying. Are their children going to want to live in isolation? No, probably not. And so at Ananda, we've always been very cognizant of this, is we live in a nice place in the country, and it's a little bit outside of town, but it's not isolated. And we find that there's certain negative impacts of being isolated. You set yourself apart. Now, what does that do? It closes the heart. You set yourself apart from other people with an attitude of isolationism, and that ultimately is not expansive in a way to think. Joy is not, you could say, bred in a spirit of isolationism. It's an expansive feeling to be joyful, to embrace other people. So at Ananda Community, we've always tried to find ways to bridge the gap. Obviously we're a little different because we're spiritual community, religiously based community, and people say, what is that place? And we say, well, come on in and find out. We're happy to share with what we have. Like I'm giving this discourse right now in May, and this is a season, April, and this is a season when the flowers bloom. We have beautiful gardens here. And so we invite the neighborhood to come. Hey, this is beautiful. Tulips are blooming, flowers are blooming. Come, and we set it up specifically. And so on the weekends in April, we'll have hundreds and hundreds of people coming here. I think last year we took a count. We had 19,000 people come in for that reason to enjoy the gardens. And we have to, of course, it takes a big community effort just to host all of these people coming weekend after weekend and during the week as well. But nevertheless, people go away and they say, they came to see the flowers. But at the same time, they said, now I know what you guys are doing out here. It's beautiful here. You guys are doing a nice thing. And some of those people might be inspired to do something similar. And I've heard people say, yeah, I wish I could live in a place like this. Now, will they? Probably not. But a seed has been planted. And in similar ways, all of our communities have some sort of a open house. Times when people come in, and I think it's important too, all of us as communities have way to serve the larger community around us, in the neighborhood, local towns. It's open, you might say. Isolationism versus openness of community. Now, I can see that these tendencies tend to play themselves out, and people sometimes don't like the community at large outside. They want to keep a certain amount of protective aura. Yeah, it's necessary. You're always going to find people on the weekends, they get intoxicated, they come in and they cause, some sort of problem. That's universal. That's human society, and you just have to accept and do your best to whatever, counteracts that. But that's not closing the gate on people. It's just kind of asking people to mind their manners and finding ways to accommodate human nature. So, but the tendency is not so much it's a tendency of mind that is the more important here. So you have to be in that. To be totally open is a ideal. You have to then be practical. Well, how are you going to mind it? How are you going to? Maybe you need to lock the gate sometimes when nobody's around. lock the car door and not leave the keys in the car. And so those sorts of things in a trusting attitude, because people being who they are sometimes cause these problems. So again, I've gone long a little bit today, and I'll probably remember a few more that I'll come back and share with you next week. But these are a few things to keep in mind. Why do communities fail? And then what does it really mean? What does failure mean? And then we take these as instructions of what might we do to anticipate this and do something positive to build community. And we'll take this idea and then apply it in a positive way in future classes. So joy to you. Sorry for going a little bit long today, but I wanted to wrap this up a little bit. So I'll see you next week, and we'll continue our conversations on community. Om Shanti. Amen.